Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law. Today we shall discuss First Family by Professor Joseph Ellis. Professor Ellis, who previously has written books on George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and the events of the Revolutionary era and the early years of the Republic, is one of America's leading historians and writers on that period. His prior work has won both a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. The book we shall discuss today, First Family, which has just come out in paperback, the hardcover edition was published in 2010, is the story of the marital and political partnership of John and Abigail Adams. It has won the Best Nonfiction by a Massachusetts Writer Award. In the fascinating pages of First Family, you will learn a trove about a marriage, views, and actions that were instrumental in creating our country, and about the historical and political events of the founding period. Professor Ellis, the author, was the very first author ever interviewed on Books of Our Time, fully a decade ago, and is a trustee of the Massachusetts School of Law and the American College of History and Legal Studies. He is with me today to discuss his latest work, First Family. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Joe, thank you for being with us for the third or fourth time, I guess.
It's always great to be back, Larry. Thank you.
John Adams was the first to understand, apparently, that British interests, the first to understand what Britain really was trying to accomplish. And he was subsequently the first to understand the real differences between what the French wanted and what the United Colonies or United States wanted. Now, how is it that in bodies full of people who are regarded as brilliant, he was the first, and for I guess for a long time the only one, to understand what was in the minds of the opponents? He understood that England couldn't, that we were going to break with England, and England couldn't win. How did he come to understand that the French view of of what they wanted in America was way different from the
time he first went to France, and he went once in '78, then came back to write the Massachusetts Constitution, and then he goes back again. He's at odds with Franklin in terms of the delegation's posture towards the French government as embodied in the French Foreign Minister Vergennes. And Vergennes hates Adams. He thinks he's a bull in a china shop, which to some extent he is. And Franklin is one of the wisest men of the age, to be sure, but he has been in France so long and he is so close to Vergennes, he can't quite see it clearly. Eventually, Jay and Adams persuade him. And then he says, he's the one that breaks the word to Vergennes, by the way, we're going to sell you out. And in so doing, would you give us another 50 million livres? You know, here's the gall to be asking for money in this. Quite a character. But Adams sees big things that have huge strategic implications and consequences really clearly. He has a feeling of the future in his bones.
There was thought that around 1803, 1805, of the same concern, and that's one of the reasons Jefferson snapped up Louisiana when he had a chance to do so. And it really didn't end till that we, in effect, threw Maximilian out of Mexico in 1865 after the end of the Civil War.
Well, Jefferson was, as long as the land to the west of the Mississippi was in Spanish hands, that was fine, because Spain was just like a dying empire.
Right.
And had been dying for hundreds of years, since 1588.
Right.
And so they can hold it, and then as soon as as soon as the wave of population gets there, they'll collapse.
Yeah.
But when that area from the Mississippi to the Rockies went over to the French in a treaty signed in 1802 or 1801, I guess, this changed the name of the game. And the city, the spot on the map, says Jefferson, that's the most important spot of all is New Orleans. Whoever controls New Orleans controls the Mississippi. Whoever controls the Mississippi controls the interior of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he sends a guy over to negotiate with Napoleon about purchasing New Orleans. And then while he's there, and then he sends Monroe over as well, Napoleon decides to sell the whole Louisiana territory. just impulsively. And his brothers come into him when he's taking a bath. Napoleon, this is in a sort of perfumed water. Says, "You can't do this. The Parliament will never approve it." He said, "The Parliament will have nothing to say about it. I'm doing it," you know. And so one of the advantages of having a total emperor monarch is when he decides to do something, it happens. So we got it for $15 million. And Jefferson's perception of that was not only did we eliminate a European predator from the North American continent, and after the Louisiana Purchase, people are thinking manifest destiny, you know, although that term doesn't come in. But he's also thinking it extends the agrarian life of the Republic, that the longer we stay agrarian, the better from a Jeffersonian point of view. Yeah. And he says this buys us another 100 years, which is just about right.
Yeah. To go back, well, okay, we became an industrial colossus roughly from 1860 to 1900.
But the census says we go from being agrarian to industrial and rural to urban sometime between 1890 and 1920.
The census is wrong. But what I mean is it's not all numbers.
That's right. That's right. They're using statistical measurements for something that might need to be more historical.
Yeah. Why was Adams called or thought of as the Colossus of Independence? What did he do in the Continental Congress for 5, 6, 8 years?
The first couple years, he was the one that the political context is that there's a strong group of people in the Congress who are moderates. They are the majority. We've had this disagreement with Great Britain, with Parliament, when its right to tax, and now the right to legislate even. But we cannot afford to break with the king and go to war against the mightiest military force on earth. We have no chance. Therefore, Adams is perceived as a troublemaker because Adams is pushing the radical agenda. And he has to learn how to conduct himself down there in a way that makes him less obnoxious. Because it's frustrating when he keeps saying things that keep coming true, you know, and you always get mad at him, you know. And his role as the leader, along with his cousin, Sam Adams, if you've ever seen the play 1776, it accurately tells that story. And it's got some inaccuracies in it, but the leading character is John Adams. And so that, and then when the war starts, and it really, notice, the war starts a year and a half, or 15 months before we formally declare independence. The war starts at Lexington and Concord in April of 75. Obviously, the independence is not fully declared until July of 76. He's really becoming manager of the military force by early summer. And
why did they give that to him?
It's not clear. He's just the major figure, and he's the leader in the Congress by that time. Especially once they declare independence, there's certain people who were leaders like Dickinson who leave, who don't feel they can serve anymore. Though Dickinson goes to serve in the militia in his own state, he's the most prominent figure. Okay, but his finest hour, you know, like Churchill, this is our finest hour, is in 76, 77, when we could easily have lost the war, and God knows what would have happened. And he's sort of holding it all together, and he's working 23-hour days. He's running a marathon at the pace of a sprinter, and he's simultaneously keeping in touch with his family, worrying about their smallpox inoculations. It's the most interesting part of his life.
Right. It was interesting that he's worrying about smallpox inoculation around the Boston area and simultaneously with Washington's army.
That's right. The most important strategic decision that Washington made during the entire war wasn't in a particular battle. It was the decision to inoculate the Continental Army. Yeah. And you couldn't, after a certain state, you couldn't get into the Army until you had already run through the inoculation process.
Yeah. That was new stuff in those days.
Absolutely.
Came up 1775.
The British and Hessian and Scottish troops on the other side, they had some problem with smallpox, but most of them had built up over generations immunities because they were more exposed over there. Right. so that the rate of smallpox in the British Army was not very high. But they could spread it to other places.
Right.
Some people thought smallpox was bad. First of all, there was about a 1 or 2% fatality rate from the inoculation, but that they thought the people that were inoculated then gave it to other people.
Right, right.
So what Washington did with Adams is, Adams suggested it, Washington did it. Benjamin Rush was in on that decision too, later great doctor and psychiatrist. But once again, he's ahead of the curve. He's ahead of the curve, ahead of what most other people are thinking.
That's interesting. Always ahead of the curve.
He's eventually behind the curve because he doesn't think the curve is right, and he doesn't buy into party politics. And eventually, he and his son both say, if I'm elected president, I'm going to do what I think is right for the country. Here's what it is. If it's politically unpopular, vote me out of office, which is exactly what they do.
Yep. Explain why he went to France and what his relationships there were with Franklin and Arthur Lee, was it, and Vergennes.
He goes to France initially in 1778 to negotiate a treaty with the French, which has already been negotiated. So he goes back, and then they make him go back almost immediately to become part of the ministry. Franklin is the major figure in the ministry, but there are 2 or 3 other people in there as well. And what we now know in a way that nobody could quite understand is that this was a total den of iniquity and corruption. Silas Deane was one of the guys. He was probably a double agent for the Brits. Franklin's personal secretary was a spy for the British government and was putting encrypted, invisible ink letters inside the hulls of dead trees to be picked up by the British. It took the CIA in the 20th century to figure this out, by the way, completely, to have the evidence for it. Really? So Adams is walking into this horrible situation, and he knows it's bad, but he doesn't know how bad it really is. And he sort of assumes responsibility for creating records. Franklin never believes in keeping a record of anything, but he gets frustrated because, he's up at 4 o'clock, and Franklin's just coming in from partying, and all these people are coming to see Franklin because Franklin is the great American. He's the sort of embodiment of America. He's going to wear his coonskin cap, even though he never wore a coonskin cap in his whole life when he's been have his portrait painted. So Adams is a bull in a china shop again because he's insisting that they calm down, they stop. They can't even meet because they can't stand to be in the same room, members of the ministry. So eventually he says, look, just have one person be the minister. The obvious person is Franklin, and then let the rest of us go home. And eventually that's what they're going to do, although instead of letting him go home, they eventually send him to be American minister to the court of St. James in England.
When did he go to Holland, and what did he do there?
1780, 81. He negotiated a separate deal with the Amsterdam bankers to assume the loans of the United States and to essentially stabilize the credit of the American government. And he was urging them to do that, and when the news of Yorktown arrived, they made the decision because then it was a safe thing. But it's like it's one of the most important things practically he did because it meant that the economy of the post-war United States was going to have the support of major European bankers, which was really important instead of us going into a huge depression. When he leaves control of the negotiations for subsequent bond issues with the Amsterdam bankers with Jefferson, and Jefferson doesn't understand finance at all. He never could even figure out how to keep his own books. He had the precise numbers, they just never added up to the right thing. And that's the reason he died broke. But he said to Jefferson, beware of the Amsterdam bankers because they will understand that you don't know what you're doing, but just realize they love money and you'll have the answer to whatever you want.
Joe, he was in the Continental Congress, he was in France, he was in Holland. And this all started in roughly 1775. And it all went until roughly, 1785 or something. Oh, more longer than that, 1788 or 89.
He comes back in 89.
Okay. And Miss
Abigail has gone over to be with him in 84, spends a year with him in France or outside of Paris, and then they move together to London, where he's the first American ambassador. And you can imagine, this is the guy who was high on the list to be killed as a traitor if the British won the war. And now he's the ambassador.
And the only person who treated him well was George III.
That's what he said. Yeah. There's a famous scene in the miniseries. It's one of the best scenes in the film about this encounter. The actor who plays George III is wonderful in this, and it's accurate. It accurately describes what Adams himself described in his diary and his letters. But they're sort of alone together in England for 3 years because nobody will talk to him.
Yeah. You know, it's not in this book, but in others that you and others have written that when George III was told that George Washington was retiring like Cincinnatus to his farm, said if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world, and he did it.
He did it.
Yeah.
He did it. And all right, somebody was saying, has anybody else done that? I said, well, we know that Lenin didn't do it, and we know that Stalin didn't do it, and we know Mao didn't do it, and thus far Castro hasn't done it. The only person who's done it is Nelson Mandela. Walk away from power at the highest level after having led a revolution to create a new kind of country.
But Joe, this is America. Bear Bryant did it. During this period, they were often, Abigail and John were often apart, and which accounts for the letters, because they didn't write each other when they were together.
The paradox of proximity, namely that we know more about them when they're apart.
How did Abigail react to these separations?
Abigail reacted, on the one hand, nobly and bravely, namely by raising the kids that were left with her and taking care of the farm and tending to the finances of the family. And on the other hand, she was really stricken and sad and on a couple of occasions close to clinical depression. Adamses completed each other. They needed to be together to be whole. But she missed it more than he did. And she didn't want him to go to France. She really didn't want him to run to agree to be vice president. And she really didn't want him to be allowed to put up for president. So she opposed all that. And she told him after they returned from America that basically he should retire now, because from now on everything he did was going to mess his career, his posterity judgment thing up. And yet in each instance he did what was right for his fame rather than what she wanted. Right. And she eventually acclimated herself to each of those decisions, but not particularly happily. Right. And like when he was president, she didn't like Philadelphia. It's a bad place to grow into, humidity, and so we know a lot about his presidency because she's writing letters from Quincy by that time.
Right. Joe, I spent a summer in Philadelphia on an 11-week trial, and I don't blame her. Hot like you wouldn't believe, humid like you wouldn't believe.
Well, they had every summer yellow fever epidemics, and
that too.
And that most of the people in the summer left the city and moved out to Germantown or some other place.
There was what has been a historically famous split between Adams and Jefferson, which did not get resolved until maybe starting around 1812 or 1815, their famous letters to each other. Why was there such political difference between the two parties over France and over England? And frankly speaking, what did France and England matter to cause such a split such as this?
Adams and Jefferson get to meet each other in the Second Continental Congress. They're partners there. Jefferson is the junior partner. They get to meet each other in France, where once again Jefferson is the junior to Adams, the senior. And then they come together when Adams is vice president and Jefferson is nominated and appointed as first Secretary of State. there will be a fissure and eventually a chasm between the two sides. One side, the Federalists, which is Washington's party and Adams's party and Hamilton's party. The other side is called Republicans. And that's, a lot of textbooks call them Democratic Republicans. That's not what they were called. They were called Republicans, okay? It's not the same party as the modern Republican Party. And the leadership there was Madison and Jefferson. The big difference here was, to some extent, foreign policy. Madison and Jefferson were pro-French. They believed the French Revolution was the American Revolution in Europe. Turned out not to be true. And that our closest allies should be France rather than England. The Federalists believed that 90% of our trade was with England, and that should drive our decisions, not fanciful ideals. However, the domestic issue here, does the federal government have the right to make domestic policy? Or does that power reside in the state? That's the Madison-Jefferson position. The Adams-Washington-Hamilton position is the federal government, created in 1787, ratified in 1788, did give the central government enumerated powers, among which was to control the economy and to play a role like creating a national bank that was justified in the, what is the clause in the Constitution, the necessary and proper clause. The Jefferson-Madison position is the desire to protect slavery. Because once the federal government can make domestic policy, slavery is doomed. Right. Or the issue is impossible to prevent from being debated. So that's the source of the difference between them. And they run against each other for the presidency twice. Once in 1796, when Adams wins by a narrow margin, 72 to 69, and once in 1800, which is, in my judgment, the dirtiest election in American history, even dirtier than 2000. And Jefferson wins by a narrow margin, mostly because Burr has bought the New York electoral votes. And that's the place where Jefferson hires this scribbler named James Thompson Callender to libel Adams. And he doesn't pay Callender what Callender thinks he's due. And so Callender turns on Jefferson, and he's the one who exposes the Sally Hemings story. Anyway, they get back together in 1812. They don't physically get back together. They never see each other again. But they establish a correspondence of 158 letters, which is regarded as the capstone correspondence of the revolutionary generation. They really were, as Rush said, the North and South poles of the American Revolution. You get to see two different views of what they think they've done, two quite different views of what they thought the American Republic was designed to be. So that there's inside the revolution itself some checks and balances, because the people themselves don't always agree.
Would it be true to say, Joe, that just as underlying the Madisonian Jeffersonian view was fear that a strong central government could abolish slavery, so too, on the other hand, underlying the Adams northern view was a desire for a strong central government so you could control trade and avoid war?
Yes, and orchestrate the development of the West.
Right.
I mean, that land. Like that, we didn't have to have an income tax until 1913.
Except briefly in 1863.
For the war, that's right.
Yeah.
But where was our money coming from? Yeah. It's coming from the sale of Western land as well as from duties.
Right.
See, that's an enormous thing, and so it needs to be managed properly. We bought Louisiana for $15 million. I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars the federal government got out of that, probably billions of dollars over the next 100 years.
Yeah. And when you fly over, when you're in an airplane over flyover country, you notice everything's perfect squares because they surveyed it.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Briefly describe the terrible enmity and what caused the terrible enmity between Hamilton and Adams.
It's really interesting because you would have thought they were both members of the same administration and same party, but they really hated each other. And Hamilton tried to rig the election in 1796 that Adams won, so that Adams would lose, mostly because Hamilton wanted to run the Federalist Party, and he knew that Adams couldn't be controlled. He was too independent. When Washington was still in charge, and as long as Hamilton was performing under the aegis of Washington's shadow, you could count on him. In fact, he was a genius. He would have got the highest score on the LSATs. But once Washington goes, the rudder on Hamilton's mind starts to go crazy. And he has visions of taking over an army and marching through the United States and putting down the Republicans in Virginia, putting them all in jail, taking Florida, going out, then taking New Orleans, and just for good measure, if he has time, going to take Mexico too. Crazy schemes. Crazy. And Adams says that he is the only person in America other than Burr who could do a Napoleon impersonation perfectly. Napoleonic, he said they deserve each other, and when one of them kills the other one, that's exactly what's really going on psychologically. Yeah. In his autobiography, he says Hamilton is that bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, and which is literally true. And he hated him, and because he saw him as a person who violated the public trust, who was the most dangerous man in America, and who had used his power as much as possible to undermine his presidency.
The army that they raised was called the Provisional Army.
Right. It was supposedly an army provisional upon arrival of the French fleet, which never arrived.
Right. They went to
Egypt.
Egypt instead, where the British wiped out the fleet at
That's right.
Abukir or somewhere like that.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with Joseph Ellis.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
Welcome back. Now, you say early in the book that it has become a little passé to study Washington among historians. They dismiss him as an imperialist, a racist, as being elitist, as being patriarchal.
The deadest, whitest male.
The deadest, whitest male. You seem to take a far more balanced view of him. You obviously are well aware of his drawbacks or deficiencies, if one wishes to call them that. You're equally well aware of his strengths, and you present a very balanced picture of him. And yet, even though you draw a balanced picture, one could get the impression from your book, I got the impression from your book, that in terms of today, what we think today, what we've thought since 1960 or 1970, he was not really a very likable guy. He was elitist. He was deeply worried about it took actions to assuage the worry about his own economics and his own finances. He was authoritarian. He was somewhat sycophantish towards the British early in his career. One could say he was grasping.
Very ambitious, yes.
Extremely ambitious. So what is, I don't know if you agree with any or all of that or some of it, but what's your general ideas about what is supposed to, it sounds like a reporter's question, that's a long speech. But what are your general ideas on these subjects?
I've written about a lot of the founders, and I would say that Benjamin Franklin was wiser than Washington. Hamilton was more brilliant. Jefferson was more intellectually sophisticated. Adams was more engaging and introspective. He's the one you'd want to have a beer with. You wouldn't want to have a beer with Washington. He wouldn't talk to you very much. Madison was more politically astute, but Washington was still the greatest. And they would all agree to that. All of the people I just mentioned would acknowledge that Washington was the greatest, and in some sense, what I call the foundingest father of them all. I begin with the assumption that this is the most politically creative moment in American history. Within that understanding, though, each of these people is a human being. And it seems to me there are two mistakes you can make. They're the exact opposite in trying to understand Washington and the founders. The one is to canonize them, to mystify and mythologize them. And there's a natural tendency to do that, or at least there was. Within the academy, as you say, the exact opposite trend obtains now. If you were a doctoral student at Harvard or Yale and said you wanted to write your dissertation on Washington's presidency, you'd be committing professional suicide. Washington and the founders are often perceived as the instigators of racism, classism, imperialism, patriarchy, and all the evils of the world. I think these are mirror images of each other, these two interpretive postures. And both of them are cartoons. And I think the distinguishing feature of much of the best work done on the founders over the last 15 years, and there's been this surge of interest in readers too, especially. Some of these books have done very well, thank God.
Your child's education depends on
my child's education depends on this. Is that flawed greatness, in which it's almost like when we're young and we look at our fathers or our parents, we first of all regard them as all powerful and omniscient. And then we go through a phase, at least my children went through a phase, where we could do no right.
Yeah, you're sui generis. Nobody else ever went through that.
But then you should be able to reach a more balanced perspective and understand your parents as fellow human beings whose flaws aren't the only way to define them, and yet who are not saints. And I think we've reached that point now with regard to the founders. So, in the case of Washington, he was avaricious about land. He had a huge ego. He's not the kind of person you'd want to work for. He was demanding beyond any sensible level, and all that beside the point, because he's the greatest leader in American history. His judgment proved impeccable in all the big ways, and we wouldn't be sitting here today. He's the only person that was indispensable in the revolutionary generation. You can imagine replacing all the others, but it's difficult to imagine the revolution succeeding and the United States becoming a viable nation without Washington there.
Joe, being a lawyer, I've been trained in specifics, you know. That obnoxious characteristic, to be sure. Let me go through some of the things that you said that would be considered less desirable in today. You talked about his avarice for land being one such thing. His great demandingness of his staff being another thing. Although that a lot of people are very demanding today.
Well, another thing, like his commander-in-chief, or even in his early days as a military officer in the French and Indian War, if you deserted or fell asleep on sentry duty, he had no compunctions about stringing you up. In other words, people would beg for mercy, and he'd say, tough. You know, he's a tough taskmaster, and there's a kind of line in his mind. If you cross that line, there's no mercy for you. And when Major Andre, the British spy, who was implicated with the Benedict Arnold attempt to take West Point, all these people said, please let Andre off because he's a good British gentleman. And he said, no. And then they said, well, let's shoot him rather than hang him. He wants to be shot. No, he's a spy. He hangs, and he hung. So there's this, and while he does reach
shooting was the way an honorable military.
An honorable man wanted to be killed by a firing squad rather than at the gallows. Hamilton pleaded with him at that moment to do that. And even though he gets to the right place in the end on slavery, he's going to disappoint you if you come to him with a 21st century expectation of racial justice. and he dies, and at the time of his death, he owns 319 slaves.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things about him that aren't going to fit neatly in some sort of modern sensibility.
Right, right. You've covered most of the specifics there. There's one other thing which I mentioned to my wife, and she was really shocked, and I wonder what you think about it. Do you think that he married for money?
The notion of marrying for love is essentially a modern idea.
Right.
And it doesn't always work, by the way. Washington was probably in love with another woman named Sally Fairfax, who happened to be married to his best friend, George William Fairfax. He married Martha Custis Dandridge, who was a widow, who was the wealthiest widow in Virginia at the time.
Yeah.
So she was the prize. But I think that making decisions about marriage in economic terms was more the rule than the exception back then. And they did have a very good marriage. And she visited him at every winter encampment during the war and didn't have to, and it was dangerous to do that. And although she destroyed all of their letters, save 3, I believe. So we don't have the same picture of their relationship that we say have of Abigail and John Adams. It seems reasonably clear that they have a warm and affectionate relationship, and it's not a marriage that is just a convenience on either side.
Yeah. I got the impression, and I'm not sure you intended to give this impression. I don't know one way or the other. But I got the impression that he changed dramatically during the Revolution itself in a lot of ways. Is that true? And if so, in what ways?
I think up until the Revolution, he's a soldier in the French and Indian War. He comes from pretty far back in the pack. He's not to the manor born. His family's been in Virginia for 5 generations, but he doesn't really inherit an estate or any money. He's got to make it on his own. Then he marries Martha, as we say, and he becomes one of the major tidewater planters at Mount Vernon and builds Mount Vernon into the estate that it is now, and begins to build up his property and his slave population. But he's a typical planter, and he's fox hunting. He loves to fox hunt. He loves to go to Annapolis to the horse races. He's not a tremendous public figure of any sort. He's trying to aspire to be one of the leading members of that kind of Virginia political or planter elite. With the coming of the Revolution, as he steps forward in 1775 to become commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, it's the beginning of a transformation in him, in part because of the enormous responsibilities that land on him, and in part because of the experience he has. He's only been out of Virginia once before in his life. He went to Barbados when he's a young boy. He catches the smallpox down there, by the way, and that's one of the reasons he's always immune to smallpox. Some people say he's immune to everything. But as the war goes on, and it's a long war, it's 7.5-year experience, I think he's exposed to opinions and to people that he hasn't seen before. That's when you can see him beginning to raise questions about slavery, for example, and begin to have serious doubts about whether or not slavery is compatible with the goals of the American Revolution. And that's certainly when he begins to think of himself not just as a provincial Virginian, but as some sort of national and even international figure. And he begins to see himself as a person who's, if this revolution succeeds, going to be the subject of an interview with Larry Velvel on this program 200 and some years later.
Nice to know George was thinking of.
Well, he is. He's performing for posterity. Somebody once said, "What has posterity ever done for me?" But he's not sure whether there's such a thing as heaven and life after death in the traditional Christian sense, and therefore, living on in the memory of future generations is his most secure form of immortality, and he becomes committed to that during the Revolution. And in that sense, everything he does after that is part of a attempt to fit that role model. And the man, in some sense, starts to become a kind of monument. Though he always remains a human being, obviously, he's very concerned with how he appears and what posterity will say about it.
Joe, I think David McCullough made the same point about John Adams rather extensively, and you may have also, I don't know. How did people like Adams and Washington come to the opinion that if this revolution succeeded, they would be remembered for hundreds of years, forever even?
Mostly by reading Roman and Greek history and the Plutarch's lives, Cato's letters, and seeing that in the classical world, the founders of those two ancient states, become major historical presences. But you're right, Adams, almost as much as Washington, is obsessed with his own fame. And in 1776, he writes a letter to Abigail, before the Declaration of Independence, and says,
Adams does.
Adams writes to Abigail, buy a leather binder, save every letter I write. And so if this succeeds, if this thing succeeds, towns, mountains, lakes are going to be named after me. And he's right. We got North Adams, Massachusetts, and we got Mount Adams and the White Mountains. And Washington is equivalently obsessed with this. In fact, in the midst of the war, when they can't find money for food or uniforms or ammunition, Washington requests and receives permission to have 10 clerks assigned to transcribe all of his wartime correspondence. They put them up in Poughkeepsie, New York. And devote over 1.5 to 2 years to transcribe them all so that they will be the record of his achievement during the Revolution.
It's sort of funny, but I have a cousin. We are equally the sons or grandsons of a Russian-Jewish poverty-stricken immigrants. He married into the Adams family, about 8 generations down. It's kind of funny. One thing that you don't see much of in today's day and age, I've seen one person in my life who had what you call the gift of silence. Personally, I think it's the trick of silence, but one can dispute it. And you mentioned that, and just for the audience, that's when somebody says something to you and you're expected to say something back and you just sit there and stare at them and you don't say a thing. And it makes people uncomfortable and you get a lot of what you want if you just can keep your mouth closed, which is a very hard thing to do because, the nature abhors of vacuums and silences. You explain how he used the gift of silence and his physical size in getting ahead in life.
I'll take the physical size first, but they sort of go together. When Washington entered a room, he was a commanding presence. He was 6'3.5". That's what they measured his body after he died for his coffin. And he was 6'3.5" and 202 pounds. The average American or Briton male at that time was 5'7" to 5'8". So he's a head taller than everybody else. John Adams said that we always picked Washington to lead us whenever we gathered just because he was always the tallest man in the room. He also...
It's not so different than today.
No, but there are certain tall people that are clumsy and oafish, and if you did a purely physical description of Washington, he had enormous hands and big hips, and he could sound off almost like an oaf, But in motion, he was like a dancer. He was a great dancer. He was a great horseman. He was a natural athlete. He was sort of like John Wayne circa 1939 in Stagecoach, And he's a kind of an action hero almost. And so he commands the space around him in a way that is extraordinarily powerful. And in fact, there's one scene at the Constitutional Convention. It could be apocryphal, though you'll see it in a lot of the history books, where Alexander Hamilton says to another delegate, Gouverneur Morris, to go up to Washington, put your hand on his shoulder and say, "How you doing, George?" Because nobody does that. And so Morris goes up to him and does that, and Washington just takes his hand off of his shoulders and looks at him, doesn't say anything, and it's like frozen, But the gift of silence, and Adams talks about Washington's gift of silence, which he so much appreciated because he was incapable of it himself. At some point, Washington understood that his own stature and his own significance was such that if he kept silent, people would read into him, almost like a Rorschach test, what they themselves wanted. And so when he's chairing the Constitutional Convention throughout the summer of 1787, he never says anything. except at the very end. He enters the debate at the very end just to get on the record. He knows, he has an elemental sense of human nature, and he's accustomed to commanding space and to being the person who will have the final say. So therefore, he doesn't need to enter the debate. The debate goes on around him, his aides, his cabinet, and then after it's over, he decides. It's a style of leadership that only certain kind of people are capable of. But he was a true master of that.
Yeah. You know, it would be entirely too political, so I will not ask the obvious question, like what presidents, if any, of modern times do you think have had similar styles of leadership in any way, shape, or form? Joe, in the book, you make it clear that Washington's passions, his passionate nature, his aggressive character, that these things had a lot to do with the way he conducted himself, self-control being one of them, and with the way he conducted, at least initially, the Revolutionary War and his presidency. And in short, some of this, of what he did as a policy or political or military matter, was psychologically determined almost. Could you explain a little bit of that?
You're a good reader of the book, Larry. Instead of being a kind of granite monument that, you know, like the thing we see on Mount Rushmore, Washington as a human being had a temper, he had vaulting ambitions. He could, and when he lost his temper as president or as a general on several occasions, people just, you know, reeled because it's just volcanic. In the war, his own temperament initially gets him into serious trouble and almost loses the war. Washington thinks of war.
Can I make a point? That's important. I want to re-emphasize that. Almost loses the war.
In the first year and a half, we're lucky. He's lucky. He's lucky that, hey, he has General Howe against him. Because Washington conceives of battle as a summons to the battlefield that has an honor quality to it. He conceives of the Continental Army as the projection of himself. And therefore, if the British present themselves, he must do battle. And he's also very proud and says, I, George Washington, can defeat the enemy on the basis of sheer will. Well, the Continental Army is no match for the British Army. The British Army has an average time of service of 7 years. The Continental Army has an average time of service of 6 months. It's ravaged by smallpox. It's got all kinds of problems. And so Washington's decision to defend New York and fight in the battles of Long Island and Manhattan proves to be a total disaster and debacle. The Continental Army starts out at 12,000 at the beginning of the battle. By the end of the battle, it's 3,000. Deaths, desertions, wounded.
And about 3,000 or 4,000 captured.
3,000 captured at Fort Washington, and George Washington himself is fleeing across New York down into New Jersey, and the war could have very well been over at that stage if Howe had pursued Washington's army. The one thing we might want to say to the audience is that there's a woman in New York named Loring, Mrs. Loring, and she's married to an American, and it's unclear whether she's a British Tory, or she's a Tory or a patriot, but Howe wants to spend the winter with Mrs. Loring. And somewhere we ought to put a statue up to this Mrs. Loring, because if Howe hadn't done that, if he had pursued Washington's army, it's almost certain that the war, this is the time the first embedded journalist, Tom Paine, says, these are the times that try men's souls, and they truly were. And it takes a while for Washington to figure out an elemental thing. He loses a lot of battles. He loses more battles than any successful general in American history. But he doesn't lose the war. And think about, you know, Lee is a great general, Napoleon, great general, Hannibal, great general. They all lose the war. Washington isn't that good a tactician, but he comes to an elemental strategic insight. He doesn't have to win. The British have to win. And if he can sustain the Continental Army and avoid annihilation of the Continental Army,
Yep.
Eventually the British will decide it's not worth continuing.
Yep.
And that's pretty much what happens. And that's an elemental insight. It's called a Fabian strategy after the Roman general Lucius Quintatus Fabius in the Punic Wars, who it's quasi-guerrilla tactics. It's not quite guerrilla because he's got a regular conventional army there, but it's a recognition that the strategic center of the rebellion, or what we might call the insurgency, isn't a place.
Right.
It's not Boston, it's not Philadelphia, it's not Charleston. They capture all those places, not New York. The strategic center of the rebellion is the Continental Army. And if he can hold that intact and avoid fighting except when he's got superior numbers and a strategic or tactical advantage, then ultimately the British will eventually give up. We don't really win the American Revolution.
Right.
It's the British decide to go leave.
Yep.
And they have a lot invested in this war, and that, you know, the war that's most comparable is the Vietnam War. Only the British are the Americans in this particular case, and the Americans are like the Vietnamese. And the British really come to the conclusion early on that this war must be won for a reason akin to the domino theory.
Right.
If we lose North America, we lose the Caribbean. If we lose the Caribbean, we lose Ireland. If we lose Ireland, we lose India.
Yep.
And it's this notion that everything's at stake, and therefore they're willing to spend enormous amounts of money and resources. And they have a delivery system, if you will, a banking system, a logistical system, a military profession that's much more sophisticated than anything that the United States has. One of the things that I got out of the research in this book is how unbelievably fortunate the United States was, because the states often refuse to meet their quotas in terms of money or troops. There's a hard core of 3,000 to 4,000 young men who serve for the duration.
Right.
A significant portion of them are African Americans.
Right. Right.
About 15%. It's the last war in which African Americans serve alongside whites, not in segregated units, until the Korean War.
Yep. Yep.
That's an amazing thing.
And not somehow that's a fact that's been hidden in American history.
Right, right, and it's also one of the reasons Washington starts to think differently about slavery. He's commanding a lot of African American troops that are fighting bravely.
Yep.
But these 3,000 or 4,000 guys aren't representative Americans. They're ex-slaves, they're indentured servants, they're recently arrived Irish or Scottish immigrants, they're fourth sons that don't have any inheritance. They're not yeoman farmer types. And they won the war. I mean, it's as simple as if they hadn't stayed together and been the nucleus, the Continental Army probably would have dissolved. And I can't understand why they did it. Because they didn't get anything for it. The pensions that were promised them were never paid. They starved throughout most of the war because they weren't provided with food on any kind of regular basis. They were in rags. When the British Army marched out at Yorktown, they laughed at the Continental Army. Yeah. Because they looked like a bunch of ragamuffins.
Didn't he play something called The World Turned Upside Down?
They say that. We're not sure that really happened. There's different sources on that. And the British commander didn't want to turn his sword over to Washington and wanted to give it to Rochambeau, the French commander, instead, because they were embarrassed at losing to these people that looked like they were just, bums. Yeah. And yet, this is the group that won the war. And that story hasn't been told. Washington won the war by being the commander-in-chief that stayed the course for 7.5 years. But these guys at the core of the Army, what he calls the soldiery, and he said it at the end of the war. He said, if someone ever tries to write the history of this, they will be accused of writing fiction, because no one will believe that a group of poor young men, ill-clad, ill-fed, sustained themselves for this long against a much superior force, and they did. So Washington gives them credit.
Joe, It ever does, is it not? Armies in democracies, as elsewhere, come from the economically lowest stratum of the society.
Well, that was true in the British Army too, and it's true in the French Army during the Napoleonic Wars. And Larry, I'm afraid it's not true I mean, it's somewhat true now. The all-volunteer Army is not representative of middle-class American society. It troubles me. It troubles me very much.
Greatly, and the same was true in Vietnam.
Absolutely, absolutely. Although the draft then, leveled the playing field to some extent, though most middle-class American boys could get out of it. But we've set up a system that essentially perpetuates what was the old, medieval and early modern notion of an army as a group of people that are the bottom of society.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing that people don't know, now, I would venture, Joe, that not one American in 100,000 knows that 15% of the corps that won the war was African American.
Right, right.
And I would venture that even a smaller percentage knows that African Americans played a great role in the building of the Capitol.
Oh, they were the major labor force.
The major labor force.
Yeah, and Washington oversaw that. The decision to put the Capitol there is an interesting story I've told in the Founding Brothers book, but one of the things that happens when Washington retires from the presidency is that, remember, Mount Vernon's only like 11 miles from the District of Columbia.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
he supervises
Yeah.
the construction. He goes over there. It's almost like his urban plantation to oversee that. But that most all of the labor is done by African Americans or Irish immigrants.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that I find very interesting was that in believing in this domino theory, it wasn't called the domino theory in those days, but
No.
that's what it was, the British government continued this war until apparently the populace finally got sick of it. And they continued it because, as you say, they thought they would lose the Caribbean, they'd lose Canada, they'd lose Ireland, they'd lose India. And what happened instead was that in the 19th century, from about 1820 on,
They're the dominant empire in the world. Yeah.
the most dominant empire in the world. And I think that's a matter of extreme relevance because if you ask me at least, well, this is political and it's only one man's view, I think we became more dominant than ever after Vietnam.
Well, maybe in both instances, I think it's certainly true with regard to Britain. It's not enough time has passed for us to say whether we can apply this to the United States and its empire. Britain learned some painful lessons in the American Revolution. And one of the lessons they learn is that they cannot insist upon imposing a coercive form of imperial authority. And therefore, they developed the notion that comes to be in the course of the 19th century of the Commonwealth, where you have a lot of autonomy permitted in places like India. Now, there's some coercive things that happen in India too. I don't want to belittle that. But they recognize that a more indirect and oblique form of imperial control works much better. And they do become the great hegemonic power of 19th and early 20th century. So instead of being the end as they feared, the American Revolution sort of is a foundation for learning. They're like the United States and Vietnam. They're a newly arrived world power in the late 18th century. They don't know how to do this. And they're learning on the job. And I think that that in the 19th century they begin to perfect it.
It is amazing when you read about Britain in the 19th century and how, literally the sun never set on the British Empire.
Right.
It was just quite amazing. Joe, thank you very much for coming down. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
To the audience, be with us again next time for the next program on Books of Our Time. Thank you for being with us.